Stanford University.
Welcome to the seminar on People, Computers, and Design. I'm Terry Winograd from Computer Science in the HCI group, and glad to welcome you back to a series which has now been going on for about 20 years, actually, and we've had a lot of really interesting speakers in general areas of human-computer interaction. Quick administrative stuff. If you want to take the course for credit, you get credit for attending all the sessions. And if you are not a CPD student, an off-campus student, then you need to attend at least 8 of those 10 in person, which you will verify by signing on a sign-up sheet. This is Ranjita. Why don't you stand up? Because everybody's looking for you after class. Who every week there will be a sign-up sheet. You check your name, sign your name in on the sign-up sheet. It's got the list of people who are on Access. So if you haven't yet signed up on Access, just sign your name separately on it. And at the end of the quarter, if you've come to all the sessions, you are done, nothing to do. If you've done 1 or 2 by remote, then you send a note certifying you've done that, and you get your credit. We'll send out details at the end, but that is pretty much all there is. And if you're SCPD, or specifically you contacted me about a conflict and we've dealt with it, then you just send in a thing at the end saying you've watched them all online. There should be a link. It works and then it quits working from time to time, but if you go to the home page for the course, which is, should I write it up? I won't bother. HCI, Human Computer Interaction, .stanford.edu/seminar. Among other things, you'll find a link to the administrative info, which I've just said, and a link to the online, Stanford Online services where you can get the talks after they've been given. Okay, so that should be all. The other thing, which some of you here recognize, this is an open seminar, so you do not have to pay Stanford any tuition to come and sit in and listen or to watch it on the web. So if you're interested, if you're not a Stanford student and you're interested, or you have friends who might be interested, welcome to everyone. Anything else administrative we need to cover? I think that's it. It's simple. So we have a speaker each week. We've got all but one of them definitely lined up now, and you will see the schedule if you go to the webpage, again, hci.stanford.edu/seminar. There is a mailing list. If you get yourself on that list, there's a thing at the bottom of the page telling you how. Then you'll get the weekly announcement in email. It's the same information that's on the webpage, but it's nice sometimes to get an email reminder. So you can sign up for that. And the schedule is up. I think, is it Stephen next week? I just realized I hadn't checked. Somebody here? No, Stephen's not here. I believe next week's speaker is Stephen Dow, who is a postdoc here in the HCI group, who's been doing work on experiments with prototyping. If it isn't, then he's 2 weeks from now, and I'm forgetting who's next week, but I think he's the one who's next week. This week we have Kim Goodwin, and we were just reminiscing. I said, "Oh, Kim, I had you come talk at a class about 4 or 5 years ago." And she said, it was 11. So as you get older, things compress, right? So I've known of her and her work for quite a long time. She's been at Cooper Design, which is, again, a company I've known well for a long time. They've done really innovative things in getting design at early phases, user-oriented design at early phases, into a variety of commercial products. Kim has done thousands, or at least hundreds of projects over a number of years, and combines what I think of as a kind of clear conceptual theoretical sense of what's important in design with a just huge wealth of experience and wisdom that comes from having been in the trenches, to put it in those terms, for all these years. And usually the people who write textbooks, and I won't name names, but if you read HCI textbooks, they're ivory tower academics. They're people who've thought about it, read the research literature, and so on. But she's written a book which really does bring this kind of wisdom from experience in. So this just came out this year, right? And I recommend it. It's heavy, but worth it. Called Designing. Why don't you run the... wait. You get that up? Designing for the Digital Age, How to Create Human-Centered Products and Services. And the interesting thing about it is it's not just about the sort of computer technical side of it. It really deals with the whole process of how do you do design in the real world, where you have products and projects and people and a whole set of issues. So I asked her to come back, talk about her wisdom in the field.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks for inviting me, and glad to be back here at Stanford. Although I do have to preface my talk with a little "Go Bears." All right. So I'm here to talk to you today about an area that's been of interest to me for a number of years now, which is designing a unified product experience. Because we talk a lot about software as software, and industrial designers talk a lot about hardware, but somehow the two have to come together to form a complete product experience. Now, I don't know about you guys, but in my lifetime at least, software has gone from being very character-based and kind of clunky, and yes, this is from War Games, for those of you who recognize it, to being, sort of graphical, but pretty ugly still, and then eventually to what we know today, which is a very rich, often beautiful, sometimes still ugly, but visually very rich medium. And so over that period of time, you would expect that there's been some evolution in the professions that deal with software, and of course there has, right? First there was programming, and then eventually this interaction design thing came along, and these two disciplines are pretty different, right? The programmers figure, well, we do the hard stuff, right? We do the heavy-duty technology, and there's these kind of lightweight designer people telling us to focus on humans and bringing this design sensibility, and that was a little alien. And to tell you the truth, in some companies it still is a little bit alien, although I think that industry has made a lot of progress in this respect. And I think that designers have learned likewise from programmers and from HCI that rigor in design is a valuable thing, right? So interaction design, I think, has become a little closer to programming over the years, and I think programming has learned from interaction design over the years. And then there came the even fluffier people, all the graphic designers. What do we do with them, right, now that we have to incorporate color and all this other stuff into our work? And I don't know if you know many graphic designers, but a lot of graphic designers talk in terms of emotion and brand and these other terms that are a little bit alien to some interaction designers and even more so to many of the programmers that I know. And so how do you get these folks working together? Well, I think over the years, most design firms at least have found good ways to do this, and a lot of in-house teams have found good ways as well. But these days, of course, computers are evolving even further, right? We have software that appears in our car dashboards, our telephones, for better or worse, sometimes worse, are becoming small computers. Medical devices, lots of these are computerized, and if you get these wrong, right, you could do real damage to people. Our entertainment is digital, right? And all kinds of everyday things that we use around the house are just getting so much more computerized and interactive. So what is a computer anymore, right? It's not just one of these. It's almost anything we touch these days. I even found recently that there are digital showers. I don't know about you guys. I'm not prepared to deal with a computer interface first thing when I get up in the morning, but they have them. So all of these hardware products are kind of interesting because you never hear somebody say, yeah, the interaction design, the software in that phone is great, but the hardware is terrible, or vice versa. You don't hear that. If one part of the product doesn't work very well, people condemn the whole product. It's kind of like a group project in school, right? Somebody screws up, the whole team fails. And it's interesting because in industry, it's very common for companies to divide hardware and software teams. It's very common to be handed a physical device prototype and told, okay, here, now make the software work. One time I was doing a consumer glucose meter, and somebody thought that it would be really simple if it only had one button, because what looks simpler than one button? Well, think about it, okay? Glucose meters do two things at their simplest, right? They take a reading of what your glucose is today, and they show you the history of what your glucose has been. So at a minimum, you've got to be able to select and move back and forth. That's really hard to do with one button. So they had to redesign the hardware once we started getting them to think about the software. And that would have been a really avoidable problem if people had integrated the two. So what we have is a visual design discipline that's largely rooted in 2 dimensions, industrial design that's largely rooted in 3 dimensions, and then we have the 4th dimension of time and behavior, which is the strength of interaction design. And the other thing about interaction design is it does overlap 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional form a little bit, because the controls we interact with are in those spaces. Now, one of the things that I find really interesting about bringing the more traditional design disciplines of visual and industrial design into a product development process is they introduce a new tension that I don't think used to exist. And that tension is really between structure and function and emotion. And that's something that I don't think interaction design is all that good at. As an interaction designer for a long time, I don't think that's a strength of my discipline. And so I really appreciate it when, I'm pushing for structure and form and somebody says, yeah, but it's just kind of uninteresting, right? Maybe it's very efficient, but it lacks something. One of our teams at Cooper was doing a museum kiosk at one point and had the interaction very clean, very efficient. And you know what the response was? Yeah, that works really well, but it's kind of boring. And so they introduced a little bit of inefficiency into the behavior because it just made it more entertaining. And the end result was actually a design that people spent probably 20 minutes with at a sitting, which is pretty remarkable for a museum kiosk. So it's not always about efficiency. When you think about the average enterprise app, it is, sure. But consumer devices in particular, there's got to be something else there. Because let's face it, we don't make product purchases just based on rationality. Okay, so I live in a neighborhood where there's not a whole lot of parking. So I have a really good rationalization for why I bought a Mini. And I can tell you that it gets good gas mileage and it has plenty of cargo space and it's all very virtuous, right? But that's not why I bought it, really, if I'm honest with myself. I bought it because I wanted it, because it was cute. And it was fun to drive. And that's really why I bought the car. And I'm a very rational person. Okay, so emotion is never really missing from the equation. And so to get this unified experience, we've got to have a unified process that incorporates the best of all these disciplines and also incorporates the best of people outside of the design field. One of the things that I've learned over a number of years doing design consulting is that design is only half of my job. And that's not an exaggeration. Literally at least 50% of the job is building consensus among a huge range of stakeholders and getting everybody moving the same direction. Doing upfront research to make sure we're designing the right thing, making sure everybody's got good process and decision-making tools. One of my jobs is to enable the business decision makers to make good decisions, right, and make sure they have all the right information about, what's going to be well received, what's not, and I can collaborate with engineers to figure out, well, what's going to cost how much to build, and we can take all those factors into account. And so those of you familiar with user-centered design processes will find this pretty familiar. This is the basic process that I find is really successful in getting good design on a pretty quick timeline and building consensus along the way. I think all 3 of those are essential in the real world. First, you have to do a little project planning, which I'm not going to spend time on today because it's kind of a boring topic. There's a bit of upfront research into what's going on with the business, how are we going to make money doing this, or save money, or whatever the objective is, and into who are the users and what is it they really need. Using that as a starting point to figure out what should the product even be? What is it we're going to build before we start trying to build it? Then we turn that research data into some models that we can use within the design team and across the broader product team in order to communicate about what we've learned in the research. So we all get a shared language, a shared set of tools to use when we're evaluating, should we go this way or should we go that way? And then from there we figure out, what are the requirements for this thing? What does it have to be and do? What does it have to accomplish? And is there any of that can wait for version 2, right? And then we actually get to the point where there's a solid design concept. We call it framework definition. In other words, what's that initial sketch look like? How many screens does it have? What are the hardware and software input mechanisms? How do we display information? How do we interact with the thing at a high level, but a sketchy level? because that starts to let us assess cost and feasibility and lots of other things that are very important. And it starts to give us something concrete to look at. This is one of the biggest challenges in industry is people spend a long time on requirements and they thrash a lot because they don't sketch something early enough. Right? They go straight from a list of here's what has to be in the product, which might be a page or it might be 200 pages of text, and then they go straight to building it. And usually if they spent a bit more time sketching, very low fidelity, just doing a really quick turnaround on things, they would get to a better answer and be able to build it a lot more efficiently. And then there's a lot of work to be done in detailed design down to what color every pixel is and what finish is on the hardware and so forth. And ultimately design is mostly done, but stuff always comes up in engineering, right? No matter how closely you collaborate with engineers as a designer, there's something that shows up that was harder to build than you thought it was going to be, and so something has to get tweaked a little bit along the way. Now, any of you who've taken classes with Terry, I'm sure, have heard about the value of iteration. Probably some of you in other classes have as well. A lot of these steps are iterative, okay? I don't want you to get the impression because I've displayed it linear, in a linear fashion that it's a linear process. It's mostly linear, but there's some recursive bits to it too. So let's dig into each of these things. So research, when I say research, a lot of times clients will say, oh, research, we're not an academic institution, we can't afford the time to do this. Research could be as simple as spending an afternoon watching some people use their iPods and figuring out what's working and what's not working, right? It could be that cheap and easy. Or research could be a month of travel around the world looking at how doctors in different places perform surgeries, okay? So it could be a real range of things, and it kind of depends on how much certainty you need, right? If you're betting a whole company on a product, well, you want to do a lot of research. If it's a quick and dirty kind of rev to an existing product, maybe a little bit will do. The main tool that I find is useful in upfront research is based primarily on ethnography. Now, that might sound a little bit odd, because you probably think of ethnography as the study of a culture, right? You're going to some foreign country and sitting down with people whose culture is really different from your own. Think about it though. Users might be pretty different from you. They might have attitudes and beliefs and experiences and training that's really different from yours. I think about this all the time anytime I do a product involving kids, because I just don't think like a kid anymore. And their reality is very different from mine. Even though I was like them once, it's really hard to remember that. Likewise, there may be a lot of assumptions that don't come to light based on pretty common methods that people use. Now, what most companies do is they go out and they say, customer, what do you want from our product? Well, have you ever seen an episode of The Simpsons where a car company asks Homer to help them design a car, the Homermobile? Okay. That's what happens. Ford has an example called the Edsel back in its history, okay? We don't go and say, what do you want? Because people don't actually know. Steve Jobs says the worst thing you can do is listen to your customers, and in a certain way, he's right. There's a way in which I think that's rhetoric, but I don't even ask customers how they behave, right? If I say, what do you do every day? What are you going to say? I'm going to pick on Terry for a sec. Terry, what did you do this morning before you came to work?
I had a meeting.
You had a meeting?
Before I came to work.
Before you came to work.
I got up, I showered, I brushed my teeth, discussed the day's plans with my wife.
Okay. So you got up, showered, brushed your teeth, discussed the day's plans with your wife. Were you in the nude when you did that?
Partly dressed.
Okay. See, he didn't mention getting dressed. Right. So, thank you, Terry, for indulging me. People always leave out the getting dressed part somehow. And that's because when we do something every day, our habits are really ingrained. We're unconscious of them. And so we can't just ask people what they do. We have to go watch them. And we need to go into the context where they would use the product. And if we're inventing a product that doesn't exist yet, we look at analogous behaviors, right? We look at what they're doing with paper and pencil and face-to-face conversation today, and we figure out what's really going on there. What are the fundamental behaviors we have to account for? So just to give you an example, here's a photo of a a surgeon replacing a knee joint, putting in an artificial joint. So user research is not always quite that graphic, but so this is one where if you've got an industrial designer and a visual designer and an interaction designer in the room, they're going to look for slightly different things, okay? So the interaction designer is going to say, there's an electronic system there, but the surgeon just asked somebody to bring in a piece of paper. What is on that piece of paper and why is it not on the computer, right? That's what's going through the interaction designer's mind, because that's a huge issue, okay? The industrial designer, meanwhile, is looking at, what's the angle of that display? Is that really positioned right? Is that the right size and shape? Is that ergonomically going to make sense? And the visual designer is going, oh man, that thing is covered in plastic. Are you kidding? I have to make the controls big and really high contrast then if they're going to show up, okay? So everybody's taking something a little different from the research. So ideally, they're all going to get a chance to observe people in context. Okay. The other thing that particularly visual and industrial designers are doing is they're looking for emotion and brand context, right? What are the kinds of things that people relate to? So if I'm designing a product, for example, for somebody who reads Dwell, shops at Crate & Barrel, and has furniture from IKEA, versus somebody who shops at Restoration Hardware, reads Better Homes and Gardens, and goes to Williams-Sonoma and so forth, there's a very different aesthetic implied there, right? There's a sort of different lifestyle. That product's going to look different for those people, right? You might not know how, but you can kind of see that that would be true. Because something that fits into this person's life aesthetically is maybe not going to fit in so well there, okay? So we're going out and we're gathering a bunch of data, maybe for a day, maybe for several weeks. But we're doing this with a pretty small team, because having 20 people go out and do user research is A, really expensive, and B, it's hard to spot patterns, because patterns are really what matters. We don't just want to say, oh, we saw this one user doing this and design the product based on that. We want to say, wow, of the 20 users we looked at, 10 of them worked this way and another 7 thought in this totally different manner. How are we going to accommodate both of those big patterns in the design of this product? Okay, so those are the kinds of things we're looking for. And it's a lot easier to spot those if you've got a small team doing the research. So generally, I find it's useful to send 2 or 3 people out to all of the product all of the research versus having 20 people each do 1 or 2 interviews each. Okay. But you have to turn that data into something that the entire product team, the product managers and the salespeople and whoever else is involved in decision making, you've got to give them some information that will help you make your case. I once observed a designer say to a room full of engineers, here's my design, isn't it great? And he had done all of these sort of semi-transparent layering things, lots of animation, and this was a while back, so it was really going to kill system performance. And the engineer said, well, why did you do that? Why is that good? And he kind of shrugged and said, well, because it looks cool. And that's not really going to be a very compelling reason, right? He couldn't convince everybody that his design was right because he didn't have any basis for an argument. Research doesn't just help you know what to build and how people think. It also helps you build credibility because you can say, you know, Mr. CEO, you're absolutely right. I wouldn't do it that way either. But all these users we saw, look how they all behaved. And that way it's not you saying I'm more credible than you are, because somebody in the room is always going to outrank you. That's just a fact of how we all work. But you have better data than they do, and you can make a better case. So you've got to develop some shared understanding here. So interaction designers are looking at all the data and thinking, how do people work, right? What's their workflow today? Where are there holes in it? Where can I make it more streamlined? Where do they run into problems? What information do they need as they make decisions, and so forth? And they're not spending tons of time documenting this stuff because ideally, when we design the product, it's going to be better than the current workflow. To some extent, interaction designers are also looking at people's mental models of the data, maybe doing some taxonomies of how people think about things, maybe thinking about how they conceive of the workflow, right? I don't know if you guys have ever seen a video. There's sort of a famously bad usability test of WinZip. Anybody ever seen that video? No? Well, they've improved on it since then, but back in the day, right, the thing you had to do with WinZip is you'd open the program and you'd basically tell it to create a container. And then you'd put your files in that container and then it would compress, right? And every time I would go to use WinZip, it was kind of a moment because it just wasn't how I thought about it, right? Because the way that we all think about compressing a file is, hey, here's my file, crunch it for me, right? And so it was a little bit backwards. And so you watch this usability test and people kind of get to this point and go, what do I do? Because their mental model was different. They just conceived of the process in a very different fashion, right? Imagine if we all had to find our files based on where all their little segments were stored across the disk, as opposed to just going to one spot and grabbing them, right? Probably the biggest amount of time that interaction designers spend at this stage is in modeling the human behavior in the form of personas, okay? So a persona is a distillation of a behavior pattern. And for any product, generally you're going to find that there are 2 or more personas, people who behave in really different ways. Now, these might be totally different demographics, right? You might have adults and kids making different personas. They might be related to market segments, right? Small business, large business. People have different degrees of specialization in their tasks, so maybe those are different behavior patterns. Or it might be around their mental model. That knee surgery, for example, the design team found that surgeons would approach the surgery in 2 completely different ways. You'd think orthopedic surgeons would all be approaching a surgery in a pretty similar fashion, but there were 2 very distinct workflows, just based on sort of a philosophy of how they thought the surgery was going to go better. And so that led to 2 different personas, okay? So what we're doing is we're looking through our data and we're comparing behaviors. So we're looking at, for example, this is a data set from some financial advisors, okay? So for example, some financial advisors spend a little time educating their clients, others spend much more. You know, do they use pre-approved tools? How often do they transact? How big are their transactions? We're looking at a lot of very objective behaviors. And then we're looking for correlations. And we're seeing, people who did this almost always did that. Why is that? Right? And these people were almost all the same in all these ways. And so that distills into a behavior pattern. So personas are distilled and derived from the data. They're not just fictional people we make up because we think it's fun. It's about expressing that behavior pattern, okay? And so the benefit to then turning that into a persona is that it starts to take on a life of its own a little bit. Now, you could just say to everybody on your team, here are the behavior patterns we saw. You could present them in sort of a dry scientific fashion and everybody would look at them and nod their heads and probably forget about them. But if instead you present those behavior patterns as archetypal people, as characters, you give them a photo and a name, they start to become a little bit more real. And it's interesting because I do find that people start to use the personas' names when they refer to certain kinds of behaviors. And they start to empathize with the personas a little bit. And we all know they're not real people. We know they're fictitious. But people start to get excited about, making Amanda happy. And they start to say, well, Pete and Maureen just need really different things. So, how can we make both of them happy in this instance? And so it starts to get people excited, and it really does a lot for building consensus. And it does a lot for helping you prioritize features and functions and so on as well. Because you can say, well, here's our presumed list of features, but you know what? Our most important personas don't care about these 5. Let's postpone them. Let's do them later. Because there's always some trade-offs to make in the process. And so back when I started doing personas at Cooper 12 years ago, they were pretty much behaviorally focused, right? It was really about what do they do all day, right? What's their basic process? How do they think? What are their goals? And so there was a little emotional context, but they were pretty functional in nature. Now, as we've really incorporated visual design and industrial design and so forth, personas started to get a little bit more of that flavor in them as well. And so it can be really useful to start incorporating a collage of what this persona's world is like, what kinds of brands do they have an affinity for and so forth. Starts to give you a little bit more complete picture. And When it comes to industrial design, sometimes it's useful to incorporate some models of what would this persona's physical space look like, right? Take a look at this, this little sketch, for example. This was actually thrown together using SketchUp's little free library of digital objects and so forth. And of course, Herman Miller, being the smart folks that they are, put a bunch of their furniture in there. But okay, let's imagine we're designing an entertainment system for this guy, right? What does his environment tell us? Well, we can see he's into pretty clean, modern look. He's fairly knowledgeable about design classics and so forth. He's got some well-known designers in his furniture. His area there is pretty sparse, right? Lots of cables and clutter and so forth are going to drive him crazy, so can we solve those issues, right? It starts to help us understand what context will our physical device, if we have one, exist in. And so we're not trying to spend a lot of time on these tools. Generally, we're spending just a few days putting together these models that encapsulate our research in order to say to everybody, here's what we learned, here's what's compelling. And believe it or not, people really relate to these tools. I've seen rooms full of engineers go, oh, what is it you're going to make me sit through? These fluffy, creative writing exercises, persona things. There's a lot of skepticism. But once they see how we use the personas, they start to get into it. And they kind of adopt the personas. And I've had development teams like print persona t-shirts and play Persona Jeopardy and do all kinds of crazy things that actually are good for team building, believe it or not. I know that's kind of a soft topic, but it is actually pretty important. So one of the things that I think an emphasis on visual and industrial design brings to the process is that an interaction designer is mostly going to focus on end goals, right? What are the things the persona wants to accomplish using our product? And so they're going to be kind of functional. Whereas a visual designer and to some extent an industrial designer is also going to say, but how do they want to feel using the product, right? What's their experience goal? So think about some of the interactions you have in your day-to-day life, right? How do you want to feel when you go to the bank, right? When you're entrusting your life's earnings to somebody, how do you want to feel about that experience? Anybody? Safe, right? You want to trust this institution. And so you're probably not going to have cartoon characters and purple and orange on that homepage, are you? Right? That doesn't make you feel safe. There's a reason most banks use lots of navy blue, right? There's a reason that they use very conservative typefaces and so forth, because they want you to feel like we've been here forever, we're going to be here forever, we're not going to do crazy risky things with your money, even though we know better at this point that they do. But their visual design is geared to make you feel a certain way, right? Hopefully their visual design is telling you the truth about who they are. But same thing with physical products, right? When you look at devices in a hospital, for example, what color are they? What colors do you see? White? Beige? Teal. Maybe some teal or some blue, right? Colors like green and blue make people think clean. They make people think of light. Occasionally red for danger, right? But you're not generally going to see hospital products that are brown, because that kind of makes you think dirt, right? You're definitely going to see a certain feeling that people are trying to evoke, right? How about if you go to a spa? What colors are you going to see there? You're going to see browns and golds and other kinds of warm things, right? You're going to see surface textures that are softer and more soothing and so forth, okay? So how we want to feel about a product is definitely incorporated into its visual language, into the colors and materials and other ways that we portray it, okay? So we distill all of our data and we say, hey guys, here's what we learned. So what does it mean? What does this mean for the kind of product or experience that we need to build? And so here's where we do some requirements. Now, this terminology can be a little confusing because sometimes when the designers are called in, a product manager has already written something called a PRD or MRD or some other acronym that means requirements document, okay? And so sometimes that's a one-page thing that says, if we build roughly this much, this product at this price, we'll make roughly this much money. That's my favorite kind of requirements document. And then there's the 200-page thing that says, item 13.12.5.7a, the list box will contain these things. Well, how do you know the list box contains these things? How do you even know there's a list box? Have you drawn anything yet? No. Okay. And so sometimes requirements documents are right on. Sometimes they're arrived at by good process. Other times they're unfortunate pieces of documentation that you kind of want to set aside for a little bit. And so it really depends on the process and the skills of the people putting those together. Ideally, our design research is informing those requirements, okay? Because we learn a whole lot out there in the world that, that maybe people haven't learned by looking at the competitors or asking the customers what they want, okay? And so we're at least going to tweak an existing requirements document if it's there, or ideally the requirements document is going to start at this point. And so the most important tool I find in developing requirements is storytelling, okay? Some of us were talking at lunch earlier about how do you get from that blank whiteboard to something that you can look at and talk about, something that's concrete. And that's a tough transition for a lot of people. It's hard to go from understanding the problem to solving it. And so one of the most human tools we can draw on, one of the most creative tools we can draw on is storytelling. Think about your childhood for a minute, okay? Reflect on how good you were at making up crazy stuff when you were little, right? That cardboard box was a school bus 1 minute and a spaceship the next, right? You were very creative, you were generative. And that's an important part of the process. It's not all of it, but we've got to get to something concrete. And so if we say, all right, now that we know our characters, right, our personas, and what motivates them, let's put them in a situation and imagine how that ideally unfolds, right? Let's give them a magic black box and see what that experience ideally would look like from their point of view. Okay, so here's the part of the process where sometimes people get uncomfortable because they say, how do you know? You're making stuff up. Well, okay, yes, you are making stuff up, and that's what you do when you create. On the other hand, how do you know what kind of birthday present your mom would like? How do you know that your girlfriend's going to be mad at you when you didn't meet her on time for a date? Right? How do you know these things? Because you know what those people care about, and you know what they like, and you know how they think and behave. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with our users, is use that human understanding and trust that part of ourselves in order to figure out, well, here's what we think they'd like. That doesn't mean we won't do some usability testing and stuff later on, but we're using it to generate. And so generally, we're going to start out with some small number, maybe half a dozen, maybe a dozen scenarios. In other words, we're going to say, let's put our personas in this kind of common situation and imagine how that can unfold. What's that ideal experience look like? And from that, we're going to generate a whole bunch of different proposed requirements that we can all then talk about and figure out, can we accomplish those things, okay? Now, from that emotional side, though, storytelling doesn't quite cut it, okay? So one of the hardest things any designer will tell you is the client who says, I don't know what I want it to look like, but I'll know it when I see it, right? Visual design and aesthetics are incredibly subjective, right? Everybody's got an opinion. They can't tell you why they like it or don't like it. But whether a CEO likes it often isn't a determiner of whether users are going to like it. And so one of the important points to build consensus about is, what do we want our product to say? What personality do we want it to convey, okay? So what do you want to convey if you're Kmart? What do you want people to associate with your brand? Anybody? Not cheap, value, right? What do you want to convey if you are Saks Fifth Avenue? Luxury, exclusivity, right? And what do you want to say if you're Apple? Other than pay me lots of money for my products, right? Stylish, simple, right? One of the things that you'll see in every Apple product is they're aiming for, let's assume our users are busy and don't have time to learn a whole bunch of stuff, okay? Let's just make it work. And so getting some consensus on what you're trying to say with a product is really important, because if you don't all know what you're saying, well, then you're all going to look at that design and take your best guess. And so if you started out your project by talking to all the stakeholders, all the the marketing people and the executives and so forth, and saying, what do you think our product is about, right? What is it you want people to take away? Well, they're going to give you a whole bunch of words. And then users are also going to give you a bunch of words about how they want to feel about that experience. Maybe not in direct response to that question, but they'll come up over the course of spending an hour or so with people. And so what's really useful is to write down all those words on a whiteboard and then start to group them and distill them into clusters and start to substitute words that are a little bit more visual, right? So for example, if you want to say intelligent, the word intelligent doesn't necessarily evoke anything visual, does it, right? If instead you say brilliant, what does that make you think, right? Clean, bright, maybe a little sparkly, right? That starts to make you think in a little bit more visual terms. And so we start to translate what we heard into a set of visual attributes called experience attributes. Typically, we're going to get to a small number of these that are most important. And generally, they're going to create some sense of tension. So for example, you might want a business tool to feel both expert and approachable, right? It can't be intimidating, but you've got to trust that it's very rich in technical expertise. So how do you balance those two words, right? And so these things are going to lead to some visual expression. Now, when we start doing this, most people in the room are kind of squirming, like, I don't know, you're getting into fluffy territory here, I'm uncomfortable. And so people can't visualize this often. So what you can start to do is use imagery to start to evoke these things, okay? And you have to focus on the emotion. Now, if you're going to use a word like secure for a piece of software, right? Some people might think, all right, well, images of bars and guards and weapons, those are all about security. Well, what you want to focus on actually is, what does secure feel like? It feels warm and enclosed. It feels solid. It feels a little bit heavy, and you're going to start to use some visual language that evokes that stuff, right? So for example, that combination lock up there at the top, it has really thick lines. It implies a certain strength. It's not dainty. And so these start to help people understand what you mean when you say, okay, here's that feeling of security that we want to evoke. Make sense? And sometimes we have to say, all right, but we don't want to take this too far, okay? You know, we might say we want our product to feel youthful, but we don't want it to feel babyish, right? We don't want it to feel infantile. We just want to be young, but we're not going to push that too far, okay? And through discussion of these kinds of things with a big room of stakeholders, we can generally get consensus on what's most important, what's least important, so that by the time we start to develop the visual and industrial look, we actually have a basis for that discussion. And we can say, okay, remember we wanted to say this, here's why it's that color. Here's why it's that shape. So that it's not anymore about what you like, what I like. It's about what we're trying to say. And we have a basis for that. Okay. And so we've done a whole bunch of analysis. We've got some consensus on what the product is going to be. So then we've got to start visualizing the thing. Okay. And here's where most, I think, design processes break down, which is the industrial designers go over here, and the interaction designers go over there, and nobody even calls the visual designers yet. And they do some separate things, right? There's some wireframes going on, maybe there's some hardware, and then eventually you try to make those two work together. Well, that's the problem, right? If instead you spend the first few days of a design phase with all three of those disciplines in the room together, all sketching and looking at possibilities, you get much better coordination. So one of the first things you have to figure out with a physical product is what platform are we talking about and what architecture? So what do I mean by those words? I use the word platform to refer to a set of components that is a specific kind of input and display method, right? And the architecture, as an industrial designer would use the term, is about how those components are arranged. So let's take a look at an example. Imagine we've got a little mobile device, okay? We could use multiple different input methods, right? We could have something that's basically a touch screen. We could have something that has soft keys around the perimeter, right? or we could use some sort of little 4-in-1 controller, right? We could do any of those things. And so we're going to have to figure out what's ideal from a design perspective and how does that intersect with what's feasible from a cost perspective, because building hardware has a fixed cost for every unit that you build. And then let's say that we decide, all right, we're going to go with this 4-in-1 controller because cost is really a critical factor. Well, then we have to figure out the architecture, right? What's the orientation of that controller versus the screen? Is that a horizontal layout or a vertical layout? How does that work? Okay, and so we're going to be sketching a whole bunch at the whiteboard, right? And using those scenarios that we started to generate to imagine how do we step through an interaction using soft buttons? How would we step through that interaction using a touch screen, right? And we start to see at the whiteboard, oh man, the soft buttons are really clumsy, or there's not a huge difference between the soft buttons and the touch screen. And so when we start to talk to other stakeholders, we can say, well, here's the design benefit, here's the cost difference in conjunction with our engineering friends, and that way we can all make an informed decision about what technologies we're going to use. And we're looking at things like, well, what kind of data do we have, right? Is it mostly lists? If so, well, a vertical screen is going to pack a whole lot more data in there than a horizontal one, right? If we're mostly watching movies, well, maybe it needs to be horizontal, or maybe it needs to switch back and forth with a gyroscope, who knows? And so we're just kind of working through possibilities, using the personas and the scenarios as our filter. So after a few days then, the interaction designers can dig a little deeper on their part of the problem, and the industrial designers can dig a little deeper on their part of the problem. And so the interaction designers are saying, okay, based on our requirements and what we've decided about our technology options, here are the pieces we have to fit together. And then using the scenarios, you can start to break out screens. Okay, so imagine that you're telling a story about, let's use a simple example like online shopping, okay? So imagine you're poking around your virtual store. You look at this product, doesn't meet your needs. You look at a list of your search results or category or whatever again, and you look at another product, oh, maybe this one's interesting, and you kind of bounce back and forth between overview and detail a lot, okay? And so you kind of want all that information readily accessible with, no more than a click or so. On the other hand, by the time you've made your decision and you're ready to say, here's my address and here's my visa number and so forth, you don't need all that product list information anymore. Therefore, it doesn't belong on the screen at the same time, right? So that's a very simplistic case, but what we're doing with the scenarios is we're saying, what kinds of tools and information are people using at the same time? And that starts to tell us what to draw. How many screens do we need? Well, we need a screen that contains these things, those things, and these other things. And then the flow in the scenario starts to tell us, well, in theory, the stuff you use first should be at the top left, stuff you use last should be at the bottom right. And that's not always going to be the right answer, but it's going to give us a starting place. Okay? And so if you let the scenario drive what you're laying out, you get to a sketch very, very quickly. And then you can start to throw more scenarios at it and evolve it. And before you know it, you have a product design that's pretty solid. Often within less than a week, you're starting to see things really solidify, and you've been able to look at a lot of different possibilities. Okay? The industrial designers, meanwhile, are starting to explore foam models, do some more sketches, check out the size and weight and feel of things, working really closely with mechanical engineers to figure out how much space do I need to fit all the components inside of here so that they're not designing something this thick when they need that much space. But at this point, the behavior and the basic form of the product is expressed in a pretty sketchy manner. Now, not all designers do this. Some designers will go straight to detail. What I find, though, is when the behavior of a product is still kind of rough and you haven't had a lot of time to refine it, if you present it in detail, people will assume you've thought it out in detail. So you kind of want the fidelity of the expression of the idea to match the fidelity of the idea, if you see what I mean. It's kind of like in a lab class, right? You're not going to express things to the nanometer if you measure them with a ruler because it implies a false precision. We're kind of doing the same thing with pixels, right? You don't want to show pixels when you've only had a week to work through something and it might still shift, okay? And so generally, you're going to see pencil sketches or things like that for interaction design. For layout of physical controls, I tend to do it in something really crude, like this I think was drawn in PowerPoint, which is a horrible drawing tool. And that's good, because it forces you not to worry about the fussy details. And what we're kind of saying here is all the things having to do with sound live on this side of the telephone, and then there's a screen with a list, and then there's some voicemail controls and things over here. So you kind of get a sense of that architecture without worrying about how it looks, okay? Because the minute that you show how it looks, people will focus on that, and they won't be able to step back and figure out if the structure makes sense, okay? But we do have to start working on that visual design language as well. And so we do the equivalent of swatches, right? So using that set of experience attributes, those words that we all agreed on, we start to do some visual language studies. So for example, for that little telephone sketch I just showed you, imagine that we came up with 3 experience attributes. Well, one is approachable, so it's got to be kind of bright and cheerful and friendly. Another is exceptional, right? So we're going to show lots of polish and maybe a little bit harder, glossier look. And trustworthy, well, maybe that's kind of soft, unassuming, and that kind of thing. And so our color palette and our shapes are going to be driven by that. At the same time that visual designers are doing that, the industrial designers are exploring what that would look like in hardware form. So for that word exceptional, for instance, where we have lots of glossy highlights and stuff in the pixels, well, we might have some chrome trim, right? We might have something that's just very severely modern, because it doesn't look like every other phone out there, right? And there are a lot of little details that'll start to imply quality. Now you can see that this is still a sketch, right? We've still got some kind of crude lines sketched in there. It's not finished. And we'll show a series of these to start getting people to say, all right, we want to go this direction versus that direction. And then finally, we've got a concept that's pretty solid. We've got a direction for the design language. And then we can do all of the little detail, which is where you spend most of your time as a designer actually is in the detail. And so we're going to look at things like the physical control behaviors, right? How many detents do we need in a hardware knob? Is it a jog dial or does it just stay in one position? That kind of thing. How does that knob feel and so forth? At the same time, the interaction designers are chunking out the design into pieces. Now, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the sort of Waterfall versus Agile development method thing. Actually, some blend of the two I think is really pretty useful, right? Once we've got a concept laid out, we can chunk the interaction design into pieces so that it can start getting built as we go. Usually something like a 3 or 4 week chunk works really well. But what we want to do is touch all the detailed design twice so that we're getting down to the level of controls and language on the screen and things like that once, and we're documenting that, or in some cases maybe building a workable prototype of it. We're getting all the engineers and subject matter experts to look at it. Maybe we're doing a round of usability testing on it. And then we're doing a second pass at it to, I say finalize, but essentially finalize it, even though something might shift a little during implementation, okay? So ideally, we're chunking it and iterating. So we're doing chunk number 1. We've got people looking at it. Designers are working on chunk number 2, and then they tweak chunk number 1 after some feedback comes back. This tends to be very fast and very efficient. And this is where the visual design and the interaction design merge, okay? So the basic visual language, the visual designer is turning into a visual system. And they're doing things like establishing a layout grid, right? So that, the layout's not haphazard. You're always doing things in certain columns and certain heights. If you look at any well-designed software from a visual point of view, you'll see that they use some fixed units and some fixed proportions, right? You'll see that things are a certain number of pixels high or wide, and they're always aligned in certain ways, okay? And so what works really well, but is a real pain from a project management point of view, is to have the visual designer and the interaction designer working in the same file. So the visual designer sets up the layers, generally in Fireworks or something like that, and all of the components. The interaction designer does a rough pass at laying out the screen based on what's been done at the whiteboard, and then the visual designer takes another pass at it, polishing it and tweaking the visual system. Okay, so I tend to find, you'll see a lot of interaction designers out there who say they only work in wireframes and they live in Illustrator. I don't think this is a great idea, because how do you know all that stuff's going to fit on the screen until you've put it in pixels at a realistic resolution? It's really easy to fool yourself in a wireframe. So I tend to think that pixels are a really important medium. Or you could do this in, your favorite prototyping tool. Things like icons can wait until pretty late in the process because they're not structural, right? You can fill those in toward the end of the process. And generally, either you want to build a pixel-perfect a pixel-perfect prototype, or you want to do a pretty detailed spec. You can get away with really loose specs with small, skilled teams. When you have a great big distributed team with varying skill levels, I find that if you don't do a pretty detailed spec, you get things going all over the place. And clients who are outsourcing find this even more important. But you do want a usability test, ideally somewhere in here, ideally before you do your last pass on the spec. Having people walk through the product, some sort of prototype with some realistic tasks makes a big difference. And then at the same time, you've got the industrial designer collaborating really closely with the mechanical engineer, and they're sharing a file as well. They're sharing a CAD file. And they're laying out exactly how all the parts are going to be assembled, where all the part breaks, and specifying whose touchscreen you're going to use and so forth for that to get ready for manufacturing. And so they're passing the file back and forth, and the industrial designer is mostly looking for, does it match the design intent, right? Let's tweak this curve a little bit, let's change this surface a little bit. And the industrial designer is working closely with the visual designer to specify the finishes and the materials and so forth that are used in production. So all of this actually works very, very well. The hard thing is, it takes really intense collaboration pretty much every day. So you don't get to go hide in your cubicle for weeks at a time. In fact, if the various members of the design team aren't looking at each other's work at least once a day, if not twice a day, they're going to diverge and it's going to get inefficient. Similarly, if the designers aren't meeting with the engineers at least once a week, and preferably more often, they're going to start doing things that are too hard to build for the timeline. And so constant collaboration is really, really critical. You've definitely got to get efficient about it, and you've got to get skilled at it as well. People think collaboration just happens automatically when you put people in a room, and it really doesn't. It's a skill just like writing code, or just like drawing a picture. You've got to learn how to listen to somebody's idea, right? Help them kind of give birth to that idea, midwife it a little bit, draw them out, then reflect back. Do I understand your idea correctly? And only then start to critique the idea. One of the things that I see happens a lot is people assume they know what the other person's saying, and then they start to critique it, and they don't actually know what that person meant, and that just kind of kills the collaboration right there. So, as you do group projects in class, think about how effectively you're collaborating, and make that part of your goal as well, because it's an absolutely critical skill. So assuming all this works well, you get the Holy Grail, right? You get the great integrated product experience where people think, oh, yeah, they couldn't think of the hardware and the software behaving differently because they go so well together. And that's the basic idea. So we do have a little time for questions. If anybody needs to run away, that's where you can reach me. Questions?
Coming up with specific details, kind of working out backwards the process that you were saying earlier.
You mean, how would I avoid somebody saying, well, I want to do this kind of control, and then kind of trying to work the product?
Especially for the kind of user cases, right?
Right.
Where you're coming up with a profile of what a typical user is going to do. Mm-hmm. How do you avoid people thinking, well, I would want it to be this way, so I'm going to come up with a user that does it this way?
Believe me, I've seen clients try and do that, where I actually had a client call once and basically say, well, we have the product spec, we kind of want to retrofit some personas to it. And my answer was, no, I'm not going to help you do that. I really find that research is key. I think that if you can get people to not jump the gun and lay out a bunch of requirements before they've gone and looked at how actual humans behave, that is a huge help. And even though the design team is primarily driving the research, it can help to get product managers or other folks to tag along for a visit or two just so that they can see reality. And photos and video clips from research are very powerful. And I think they help quite a bit because people can see, oh, you're not just telling me this is so, you're showing me 6 different photos that demonstrates that people use our devices like this. And data is your friend. I think that it's really difficult to win those arguments otherwise because the people most often wanting to do that retrofitting are the product manager or the CEO or somebody else who's making decisions about the product. It's usually them. And the only way you're going to win arguments with those folks is with data, in my experience. So, not a perfect answer. You're still going to see it happening on occasion, but always going back to the data is a huge help. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
One of the things that Bill Verplank taught me in the years that we taught together was that we often teach the normal user-centered design pipeline of start out with observation and then do some kind of storyboarding and prototypes and then build the final thing. And Bill told me once, he says, look, sometimes you've got a neat technical innovation, and the question is, how can we get this out there? So, hey, we just invented tree maps. What are tree maps good for? And so I think there are some times where you've got the technology, and the question is, what personas would want this technology?
Sure, absolutely. I think that is definitely the case. I mean, if you look at how innovation happens in industry in general, I think it comes from 2 directions, right? I mean, you can look at people have long lists of sources of innovation, but I think it's fundamentally 2. One is understanding human beings and how they behave and what they need. And the other is, ooh, here's a neat technology, what can we do with it? And so, yes, I have on occasion had a project where somebody says, hey, what can we do with this pile of technology? And we still go out and do a little research into personas, and it's very imaginative, right? And we're not quite as sure that we're going to hit the mark that way. Right, we have less certainty that we're going to come up with a good solution. But still, by saying who are our users and what do they need, you can still come up with good uses. Now, on occasion, though, I've used the same approach to kill technology. Right? Had a client once who said, we have this great tool for turning VHS tapes into digital video. You plug our dongle into your computer, you buy our software, ta-da. We said, okay, let's go do some research. And we looked at how people were using their photos and their video. And it was one of those things where there wasn't there weren't a lot of digital video products at the time. It was still a pretty new category. But what we found was people would swear to you that wedding video was one of their most important possessions, and they would throw it out the window in a house fire right after the kid and the dog to make sure they saved it. But in the past 20 years, they'd never watched it, And we found that, like people converting slides and things like that, well, they didn't do that themselves. They sent it out to a service. And the services existed, and they were really cheap. And so we went back to our client, and we said, based on the behavior that we see, we're not convinced this is a great investment for you to build this product. But we found another opportunity, which is people really wanted the ability to share their lives with other people around them. And so if they could share digital video based on recent events, that would be a big deal. And so, our client didn't build the first product, and they started working on the second. So, I think sometimes research tells you that you've got some bad ideas too, and that's okay. Design and this kind of user research is certainly not a complete solution. It doesn't guarantee success. I do think it increases the chances of success quite a bit. What else? Yeah.
Could you comment maybe from the aspects of design that hit on personas, the relationships among people, as well as the overall process on differences you might see between more traditional desktop becoming mobile?
In my experience, it's not so much a difference in the personas as it is in their willingness to compromise. I think the biggest distinction that I see between the mobile context and a desktop or sort of traditional web context is when people are sitting at a desk, they kind of want a really good tool. When they're out in the world, they're willing to put up with crummier tools in order to get that piece of data, right? It's kind of like the Swiss Army knife, right? When you're at home, you want a real pair of scissors. By gosh, when you're out in the field and you need to snip off a button or something, that annoying little pair of scissors on your Swiss Army knife is just fine. But you would never use it as a substitute for real scissors, right? Your expectations are lower in that context. I don't know if I answered your question, though.
The other aspect is the context seems to be much more complicated.
Yes.
Often they have better things to do, like driving.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah.
Checking on their cup of tea.
Right, and you know, personas are a piece of the puzzle. HCI principles are absolutely another piece of it, right? I mean, we know how much attention people can afford when they're driving, and it's not much. And so we've got to consider those things as well. One of the things that any good designer should bring to the equation is not just that user research, but absolutely a head full of design principles and patterns too. But yeah, context is absolutely critical, and the personas are part of putting that context together. There are a lot of people who will try to debate what is good or bad design, right? And they'll say, here's a design principle that's absolute. There are not a lot of design principles that are absolute, because what's good design in one context might be really awful design in another, right? Terry?
I have a question about training.
Yeah.
Take two polls here. One is you say to one student, you become a really good programmer. You say to the next student, you become a really good visual designer, and so on. You say, now get together on a team, Kim will run the team, and you'll all do a great job.
Okay.
The other is, to really be in this field, you should know some visual design, know some programming. Where on that spectrum?
Yeah. Interesting question, and it's a multi-layered answer, I think, because this is an ongoing debate in the design community as well, which is how specialized are you? I think that if you want the absolute best programming, and you want world-class visual design, and you want world-class behavior, then I think people who are specialized are going to do the best job at those things. And so I think you'll find a lot of consulting firms have very specialized roles. That said, if you're a designer or even a designer/developer in a startup, you may be doing all those things yourself. And so I think there's always going to be a role for generalists, but I think there's also a role for specialists. I would say that at a minimum, though, you want to be somewhat literate in these other fields, right? I am not a programmer, nor would I ever want to be one, but I have enough knowledge to kind of have an idea of what sorts of things are hard and what sorts of things are easy. Right? And I know enough that I can help translate between the programmers and the marketing people, which is often a designer's job. But you know, I want to leave the programming to the people who are really good at it. I think any good interaction designer needs to be at least visually literate. You know, you need to know at least the basics of layout and visual hierarchy and things like that. Likewise, you need to know some physical ergonomics. I think that engineers should be at least somewhat literate in those things as well. But I think it's working vocabulary, right? It's like the cardiologist and the radiologist can talk to each other, but they don't have to master each other's specialties. One of the trends that I've seen in some of the academic programs is in design, and I don't know how much this is happening in computer science, but in design, a lot of design schools have students attend all of the same classes for the first year, regardless of their design discipline. Which I think is an interesting foundation, right? Because there are certain fundamentals of design that you need, whether you're doing visual design or industrial design or architecture. I think there's some room for that kind of overlap in a computer science program as well. I'm not as familiar with the CS programs. I'm sure you are more so than I am. Other questions? Anybody?
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks everybody.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.